Well, hey there. You have stumbled into Sister Sharpens Sister, where three sisters get together each week and talk about first one thing and then another.
Welcome to Sister Sharpens Sister. We are back again with another episode of talking about food additives. And today we have a special guest, Arnie Vaughn. He'll be joining us here shortly. And I have got bronchitis, so doing too much talking makes me cough. I've even got an inhaler and I got a shot in my butt and all kinds of stuff. So it's going to be Dee Dee and Shalon and Arnie mostly in this episode. I'm going to be sitting over in the corner, just, like supervising. So let's get into it.
Okay, welcome. So welcome, Mr. Vaughn.
Greetings.
To start off on our conversation about additives, we had previously talked about them being added to our foods for cost effectiveness and shelf stability, but what are some other reasons and why?
Why?
Yes.
Well, I think originally a lot of them, when you started seeing them come into, I don't know, more prominence and being used more for food additives, you started looking at differing demands by the population. Because what you have to keep in mind is that when we started transitioning, really, and I think it was probably 60s was a big time for it, but 60s and 70s, you started seeing more emphasis, more information about heart disease and diabetes and cancer and different reasons why people became more weight conscious. It was no longer a status symbol to become, to be heavier. The status symbol was to be, kind of that moving from the, I don't know, Marilyn Monroe figure to the Twiggy figure.
Yes.
Kind of idea, where svelte and slim and, that kind of idea. So you started having this emphasis more on calorie levels and sugar levels and salt levels, and food industry responded by, okay, here's this food additive that will take its place. And probably one of the first prominent ones was saccharin, being used for things like Tab and Diet Coke and, all the products that originally kind of started out as diet sodas, because we want to get away from the sugar. We want to get away from the calories. So what's that healthy alternative?
Mm-hmm.
So you started to see those kinds of, I think, health emphasis. And it's evolved from there into that idea of, okay, I still want my evening ice cream before I go to bed. So I want something that's not going to have as many calories, want something that's not going to have as much sugar, and I want something that's not going to have as much fat, but I want it to taste just like grandma's homemade ice cream. And I want it to have the same mouthfeel. And I want it to have to look in the bowl exactly the same. And I want it to scoop the same. And I want it to melt the same, all these things. And you're not going to do that with, a recipe that basically is surrounded by sugar and fat and, all these things that are going to be very high in calories and very high in sugar and very high in fat, because that's what gives, to continue with the example that we're talking about, that's what gives ice cream the taste and the mouthfeel, the texture,
Mm-hmm.
all of those, qualities that we associate with really good ice cream.
Right.
And you can't do that unless you start looking for, okay, well, how can we get the same texture? How can we make it melt in our mouth the same way? How can we get the same sweetness? So all of these products started to be developed, and all these companies had teams of scientists developing what's going to be the next big artificial sweetener, what's going to be the next big artificial fat substitute? What's going to be the next big whatever that is that's going to
Mm-hmm.
give it that quality? And it even continues in today of, okay, if it's I can't eat gluten. So if I can't
Mm,
eat gluten, how am I going to make my bread taste the same way and feel the same way and have the same height and the same air bubbles and structure and toast the same way and grill the same way if I don't use flour?
right.
So that's where a lot of that came from.
Okay. I know, Dee, you have uh, some great questions. If you want to go ahead and
Well, I don't know.
unleash one.
I don't know if we have time for them all, but gosh, oh, are there any types of foods that were more likely to have food additives added to them?
Yeah, honestly, I think if we look at, and I hate to say this, but if you look at the way that your typical grocery store is set up, you have your produce typically is in one corner, your meat
Meat.
is in one corner, your dairy is in one corner,
Mhm.
and then we have what we call our center aisle foods. A lot of those center aisle foods are going to have additives of some kind. Now, they may be, something very, I guess what I would call kind of minimal.
Mhm.
And it might be something like ascorbic acid, vitamin C. It might be something like salt.
Yeah.
It might be something like vinegar. We talk about pickles.
Mhm.
So it might be something that, we would consider natural and, really very safe. And then we get into things like a lot of the processed cookies, what we call store-bought cookies, when we get into things like a lot of the mixes, what we would consider ultra processed. And
Mhm.
by ultra processed, I mean, an awful lot of food has been processed. So we
Yes.
can't just say that processed foods is bad. Uh, you know, because ground beef is processed because they
Right.
grind it.
Canned beans.
But yeah, canned
Yeah.
beans, But when we start talking about this idea of taking a potato and we're going to cook it and we're going to dry it and we're going to turn it into a powder and we're going to add this, butter flavoring and all this stuff so that we turn a basically what is a
Whole
and
food.
again I hate to say it this way but it's a bag of dust that if you add hot water to it all of a sudden it's this creamy cheesy mashed potatoes that
Mm.
have the salt and the butter and the all this stuff in it that makes it taste so wonderful but that doesn't come from you know adding butter adding
Yeah.
salt it's all these other things that come with it.
I do have a question just popped in my head. And as a dietitian, what is your breaking point when it comes to this is processed food that is okay every now and then, and this is ultra processed food that is like you should really avoid that stuff? Is there a certain amount of ingredients that you look for? Is it just the type of ingredients that are in it?
I guess if we were to talk about a perfect world.
Because what I was thinking when he was talking and he started off with a potato, I was like, potato chips are not that processed because they're really only three ingredients, right?
Should be.
Should be. I mean, they're
Should
yes,
be.
they're fried,
Yeah, should
but
be.
it should be just potatoes, salt, and oil.
Yeah, but that's not what we see. That's not what we see in an
Well,
awful lot of these products. So is there a breaking point? And this is where it gets really kind of I don't know. It really gets difficult for me as a dietitian because in a perfect world, with a really good retail system and access and finances and, all of these things that go into how do we eat healthy and where do we get our foods, you have to take into account that an awful lot of these foods tend to be very inexpensive.
Mhm.
They're
easy to make.
They're easy to make.
Use.
They're easy to use. They don't require, and again, this is where we've gotten to is they don't require a lot of cooking skill because, the mashed potatoes we talk about is, boil or microwave X amount of hot water and pour it in and stir it and
Yeah.
put it on the, put it on the
it.
plate. And that's really all that you have to do.
Yeah.
So it really gets hard because, when we start talking about what would be best for people, you have to take into account their finances. You have to take into account availability. Here in West Virginia, we have a limited number of grocery stores with limited shelf space. So you don't tend to see, you tend to see things that people are going to be, fairly easy to fix, fairly standard foods. You don't have a wide variety, and you don't tend to have a lot of those, what I would call upper end healthier alternatives. In other words, those things that tend to have fewer additives. If there is a health food section in the store, it's smaller.
I will say, coming from Florida and having access to a plethora of health food options, I was quite surprised with Kroger's select section that they have here. So that was surprising. I was pleased with that. It was a good thing I noticed.
So it's really hard to say what's a cutoff. What I would like to be able to tell people is that we should, because I guess from a personal standpoint, and what I try to talk to people about is, and I don't know, it's kind of a voguish term, but that idea of clean eating, that idea that we should try to minimize where we are available, that idea of especially what I would term those ultra processed things, the things that have really been, I don't know, less made, in a kitchen and more made what it feels like on a chemist bench.
Yeah.
That idea that there's so much that's been done to it and so much work and so much, they've gone through so many processes that you really kind of go, is this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde's formula, or is it really something that is good for us? So, kind of on that end, yeah, I'd rather people be shopping in the fresh meat section. I would much rather them, shopping in the produce section than the, canned that kind of idea. But, in this situation, it's sometimes you are picking your battles and saying, okay, I know it's a little bit processed, but, frozen vegetables are fine. They're picked at the peak of ripeness. They tend to be, have a high nutritional value. So they tend to be a good choice. But when you start talking about the dried broccoli and cheese soup package, that's a different matter, so it's, ideally, yes, you'd like to say, let's go this direction and let's try to do this because it's going to be better for you. It's going to be better for your family. They're going to be, not that we know all the impact, but there's potential for less impact.
Yeah.
Where I come from is that idea that it's better to, try to, where you can, buy the potato, make your own, whether it's mashed potatoes or a baked potato, put it in the microwave kind of idea, but start with the food and, try to do it that way.
Yeah.
From the standpoint of a dietitian as well, I have an awful lot of people that talk to me, because I'm also a certified diabetes educator. They talk to me about what's the best thing for my diabetes. Well, look, if we're going to just talk about beverages, look, the best beverage is always going to be water, you know, at least in most places. Obviously in some situations, the water is not exactly as safe as in others, but that's still going to be the best. You're not worried about the sugar. You're not worried about additives. You're not worried about all these other things, potential impacts of too much caffeine. But, when we come down to it and they say, I want something, I do drink water, but I still like something else to have, then, you know, what's going to be a good choice for me? Well, look, within reason, a diet pop is not going to make or break you, but we want to try to move away from that idea that I'm drinking, X amount, because we know that that is going to, if you're drinking would it just be better for me to drink the regular sugar stuff? You know, not really,
with,
and especially when, I've got a lot of patients that are, I hate to say it, they're drinking a 12 pack a day.
mercy.
So when
With
you start doing
diabetes,
That's a
that,
lot.
yes, yes,
That's a lot.
yeah, it is. It's
Okay. I found for myself personally, when it comes to switching from foods that have a lot of additives in them to foods that don't, and specifically, I'm going to speak about peanut butter. Because when you get in the habit of eating peanut butter that's truly natural, and you read the ingredients on it, and the ingredients are peanuts and salt, you eat that for a while, and then you eat the other kind, it tastes awful. The other kind tastes awful. You'll find that once you go to eating the foods without all the additives in it, you're going to prefer the foods without the additives in it.
I wish I could say that works for me because it doesn't. Because I can very easily eat natural peanut butter forever and then still enjoy a Jif PB&J.
Well, no, and I can tell you that you can very easily get back in the old habit of just eating the old style of peanut butter with all the stuff added to it. It's easy to
Yeah.
do. It's easy to fall back into it.
I wish I
But
had like an immediate reaction when I went back to eating the very processed, highly sugared foods that just like made me to the point where I will never eat that again.
yeah, I find that taste preference. It's interesting because
Does it stem from what we're fed as kids?
I think a lot of it is learned, and whether we learn it as kids or we learn it as we go. It's like, okay, as we're in high school and we go out with our friends and we go out and we see what they eat, and then we get into our jobs and we go out and eat, or we go out afterwards with friends and we see what they have and we get these experiences. We start learning other things, but
We try
you
the
know,
thing that our friend likes, and it's yeah.
and I look, it's very strange. Our four kids, the girls very early had very varied palates. They tended to like a lot of different things. The boys, no. Now the boys will eat a lot of different things, because they've gotten out, they've gone out with friends, they've been, in the force, in the military, and they've, had to, you know, eat different things and go to different places, and this is what's available. So, oh, you know what, I actually like that, that's pretty good. So they've gotten different tastes. I think some of it is, but I think a lot of it is socialized. It's cultural too.
Yeah.
But I think, to me, a lot of it is, and strange as it sounds, it's a lot like, the fast food that we have, in that, you know, that idea that I can really love when I see, somebody that is taking and cutting up, when they're going to make French fries for me in a restaurant, that they have cut up the potatoes and they have fried the potatoes and they have made me real French fries. I love those
Like they
because
do
I think,
Five Guys.
yeah, and that's a really good example. And then you compare that with, I know that there are, this list of stuff in McDonald's French fries, but I still, knowing that from an intellectual standpoint, can still go, those are really good fries.
They taste good. Yeah.
Yeah, they do. And knowing that they have all this stuff in them instead of potato and salt and oil, because, and to a certain extent, they're engineered that way.
Yeah.
These companies have really become incredibly adept at developing, very specific flavors and very specific textures, and really coming up and, not just making something that tastes good, but also doing all of the advertising that convinces us that it is the best idea.
Yeah.
Are food additives addictive?
I don't know that there's really any evidence that there is, an addictive property. In other words, in the way that we think of medications, and the way that we think of alcohol, and the way that we think of nicotine, that there's a physical, I don't know, that there's a neuron connection.
Don't they say that sugar does the same thing as like cocaine in the brain though?
I don't.
And I know sugar's an additive, but it's not like one of the, lab-based additives.
Yeah, I don't know, and I guess more what I would say is that I do believe, to a certain extent, and I don't know if it's mental or emotional or physical, in other words, like a physical addiction. I don't know which of those it would be, but I do believe that food, less, that idea of, a specific additive in that food is addictive. But I do believe that food in that way, in that idea that people have a, what we commonly refer to as a sweet tooth. Oh, I just got a sweet tooth. I just have a sweet tooth, and I just have to have my ice cream, or I just have to have my snack cake, or I just have to have something along those lines. And then the alternative is that, I guess, for lack of a better way to term it, a salt tooth. I need to have, I've got to have my chips, with TV, or my,
That's
movie
me.
theater butter popcorn with the extra salt and all that. But yeah, but that idea that, I've that side of it. So I do think there are, I don't know in the classic terminology of addictive, but I do believe that there is a great deal of compulsion. And I do believe that there is some addiction to food. I don't know that there's any good sign or any good research that is showing that, they've developed an addictive additive.
Yeah, it's not like they put cocaine in Coca-Cola anymore,
Yeah.
right?
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, boy, those were some interesting ones.
Now, how are food additives determined to be safe for human consumption?
There's an awful lot of tests, and I know people, may not always believe this, but USDA and FDA, an awful lot of labs across the country, including a lot of university labs, do a lot of different kinds of testing. Some of the testing is toxicology testing. So they're really looking at, what does this do? Is there a toxic effect? Is there a toxic level? In other words, okay, and this is where you start getting into discussion, and you may have heard of things like parts per million or parts per billion. In other words, what is the concentration of these things? And, at what level is it good? At what level is it bad? At what level is it terrible? Kind of idea. They do reproductive studies. So, in other words, is this affecting reproductive cycles? Is this affecting, is this potentially something that can cause, as we've seen in different cases, is this something that can cause birth defects? Are there sometimes they'll do developmental studies. In other words, does this affect how how our organs develop, how our brains develop? And something that's newer that they're doing now is what they call PCR testing. And that's forgive me, I don't remember what it means, but it's basically looking at, can you find something in this? So it's looking at things like, can you find allergens in it? Can you find toxins in it? Can you find heavy minerals in it? Things like lead, so they will do that because that's something that they do very well. They do chromatography, gas chromatography, to really look at, and they can see what is everything in here, so they really do look at a lot of this stuff, and they really try to. One of the issues that comes up though is, and this is, again, I really do believe in my heart that USDA and FDA are trying to do the right thing, but we also have an awful lot of political maneuvering around things, and that idea of, do we regulate? How much do we regulate? Do we deregulate? Because this is something that's, potentially handicapping the industry and making it harder for them to operate and make a profit, et cetera, et cetera.
So, how does the human body metabolize our artificial food additives? How does the body process it? Absorption, digestion, excretion. And when I came up with these questions, what popped into my head were these artificial sweeteners that if you eat too much of them, you're going to be sitting on a throne. So the body kind of just sweeps through.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it really depends. There's a whole kind of gamut of, in some cases, we do see that some of this stuff gets into the body and is either broken down by the liver, broken down by the kidneys, excreted out in one form or another. But we do see that a lot of these things also pretty much go straight through. In other words, they're not absorbed into the body, and we're not always sure. Again, I think it's different for each one, and it's different for what we see. A really good example from a couple of years ago was Olestra, and that was the big fat substitute.
Yeah, we've talked about that.
So that was a really good example, because what we found is it went right through, but it went right through in a really rapid sequence. So
Yeah.
it was not it was one of those very not necessarily harmful, but potentially really embarrassing things. So it really depends on, and I don't know that, that's where it gets difficult, because when you really look at something and you look at this, doing that research to say, where does it go and how does it break down, and what all the particles are, that come out of that, we can know what happens in a lab, but what happens in the body can be drastically different. And especially when you may have 2 additives or 5 additives or 10 additives, do they work differently together?
Right.
Are they metabolized differently together? And we just don't have a lot of good information about it.
Yeah, you could be eating different foods. Some people have sensitivities, other people don't.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everybody's different, right? We say that everybody is different.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Now, is there a limitation on how many additives can be added to one food? And like, for example, if you have a serving of sandwich bread, is there a certain percentage of the ingredients within that bread, in that recipe, that can be added to it, to where if you add too many, then the FDA or somebody's going to say, no, you can't do that.
Typically, no. Typically, there's
Okay.
not a, okay, you can only have, 3 additives in drinks, or 5 additives in, pickles, or 12 additives in, mashed potato mix. There's not really any kind of regulation as far as that's concerned. What you see more is that specific additives do have a, you cannot add more than X amount, you know, and what a lot of it comes down to are things like, okay, you might not be able to have more than, I don't know, 1 milligram per kilogram, for the average person, which might work out to, okay, you know, uh, in a specific thing, you might not be able to put more than, 5 milligrams, but okay, that's, if that goes into that mashed potato mix, what you might have in that situation is okay, this is a mashed potato mix that is family size, made to make 8 servings or 12 servings. And in that 12 servings, you can have so much per serving.
Mm, okay.
So that's kind of on us as consumers of, if we're eating 4 servings, as many of us tend to do,
Mhm.
then we're going to get more of that additive. But there's not really,
Yeah.
something along those lines that says, okay, the food label can only be this long.
Right.
It can be as long as it needs to be, which is why you have some that are, you know, that idea of, and going back to the peanut butter, it's, peanuts and salt, it's, or maybe just peanuts. But,
Mhm.
you might have something as well that is, you know, no sugar, no fat, blah, 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 ice cream
Mm-hmm.
that has the food label that has, 35 ingredients.
Mhm. So now, what are the potential health risks for all of these additives?
I don't know that we have a really good idea of what, kind of the positive versus the negative, and what the long term, again, that's that idea of short term effects, and moderate term and long term effects, and what happens when we continue to eat these items. I don't know that we have really good information about a lot of that. um, when and this is part of the, I guess, what I would call inherent risk, is when you start looking at a lot of this, is you find a lot of the information tends to be very biased in one direction or another. you
Mhm.
know
Mm-hmm.
and it's really hard to find what, the reality is of,
Mhm.
is this really bad, or is this not as bad as we think it is, kind of idea.
Mhm.
Well, I think we know that ultra processed foods are not great.
No, not for health. No.
Yeah.
Well, look, to me, it's always going to be better. And again, I'll just go back to this. It's always going to be better if we can eat more of what we would prepare, what we would cook. Um,
Mhm.
but it really gets, and this is where we've gotten ourselves, to a certain extent, painted into a corner, because we've gotten into this idea that we as human beings are not fulfilled unless our schedule is this wide, that we've got to work all day, and then our kids have to be involved in all these different things. And if we're not on the go all the time, somehow we're not successful. And what that
Mhm.
plays into is this idea of more and more processed, you know,
Mhm.
because you don't have time to cook.
Yeah. So we're either doing very ultra processed things at home, or we're doing very ultra processed things at,
Drive-through.
at the drive-through. Yes. And we've kind of gotten out of the habit of doing some of the things, and really, even to a certain extent, teaching the skills necessary to be able to, take these, what we would call,
Whole
healthier,
ingredients.
healthier ingredients, and be able to make the things that are going to benefit us, and really find something that tastes better than the ultra processed, without all of the extra.
Well, if people want to learn more about food additives, and they want to do more reading on it, is there a website that you would suggest that they go to read?
I spent a lot of time the last couple of days looking, and unfortunately, I still think that an awful lot of the websites really try to paint things in one direction or another. In other words, they try to either say that, all of this stuff isn't that bad, or all of this stuff is really horrible, and it is the worst absolute thing in the world. So it's, I think, look at all the different evidence. Don't just look at one site and go, okay, well, this stuff's safe, I don't have to worry about it. Or on this end, this stuff is horrible and I can't eat, all of this stuff because it has this in it.
It's a personal decision.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent it is, and it's really looking at what can you do to at least try to, where you can, minimize the impact.
Okay, that's the end of the episode for today. But next week when we come back, Arnie, if I can find him right there, right there.
Hey.
He will come back and we're going to talk more about where you can go to find out information about additives, and maybe some people that you can talk to if you have problems with them and you don't want them put in your stuff anymore. So, yeah. All right.
Yep.
Okay. Bye.
Adios.
Thanks for joining us on Sister Sharpens Sister. We certainly appreciate you. And if you could, like, comment, subscribe, share, hit the notification bell. We'll talk to you next week. Bye.